So what is an effect, also called a side effect? And I will use these terms interchangeably. So when I say effect, I mean side effect and the other way around. But what is that? Well, let's not forget that our components in the React app and our React app as a whole, and also especially the React library itself, has one main job: to render the UI, to react to our user input, to re-render the UI when it's needed. That is what we focused on thus far. With state and events and all of that, the main job was to bring something onto the screen and to make sure that the user may interact with that something and that what's shown on the screen may change based on certain events, for example, based on a button click or some text being entered. So therefore, that's the main job of React and of our application. We want to evaluate and render the JSX code and the DOM. We want to manage state and props to make sure that every component has the data it needs and that we reflect the user input correctly. We want to react to user events as mentioned. And of course, React is there to also re-evaluate our components and their JSX code and manipulate the real DOM as needed. So that's all baked into React with the tools and features we learned thus far and which we will dive into throughout this course, of course. So something like the use state hook, props, and so on. That's the main job. And if we have a look at a React component, this is a component from this module's project, which I'll dive into in a second, then we learned that a component is just a function, therefore it's executed top to bottom, and everything in that function in the end deals with bringing something onto the screen and or with reacting to user input, to clicks, and so on. So that's what this function is all about. We may use state in there, we may have other functions in there, which for example are triggered upon a button press and so on. But everything we have in this component function is concerned with bringing something onto the screen. Now, therefore, side effects are everything else that might be happening in your application. And a good example here is sending a HTTP request or storing something in browser storage, in local storage, for example. But you could also think about timers or intervals which you set in your code. These are all tasks which you of course often have to consider in your application. For example, a lot of web applications need to send HTTP requests to backend servers, but these tasks are all not related to bringing something onto the screen, at least not directly. Of course, you might be sending a HTTP request to then draw something onto the screen once you got the response, but sending the request itself and handling potential errors and so on, that's not something you need React for. That's not something React cares about. That's not what React is there for. It's not something that is related to drawing something onto the screen directly or anything like that. So these are therefore tasks which must happen outside of the normal component evaluation, so outside of your normal component function. Because you must not forget that this function, this app function for example, is re-executed by React automatically whenever, for example, the state in this component function changes. Whenever this is logged in state would change here, this entire function reruns, and React then basically checks what the new result of this function execution, so the new JSX code, looks like, and if, compared to the previous result, it should go to the real DOM and make some changes there. And we'll dive deeper into how exactly React works under the hood in a separate section, but this is what you learned thus far, and this is what React does. Now, since this is what's happening, if we would send a HTTP request, for example, directly here, then we would send this request whenever this function reruns. So for example, whenever this state changes. And that might sometimes be what you want, but definitely not always. And if in response to your HTTP request, you, for example, eventually change some state, you would even create an infinite loop. Because you would send a request whenever the function reruns, and in response to the request, you change some state which triggers this function again. So therefore, such side effects should not go directly into this component function, because that would most likely create bugs, infinite loops, or simply send too many HTTP requests, to stick with that example. Therefore, we'll have a better tool for handling side effects, and that's a special React hook which we can use, the useEffect hook. The useEffect hook is simply another built-in hook, so another function you can run inside of your component function that will do something special. The useEffect hook is called with two arguments, with two parameters. The first argument is a function that should be executed after every component evaluation if the specified dependencies changed. And the specified dependencies are the second argument that you pass in. That's an array full of dependencies, and you will see how these dependencies look like throughout this module. So an array full of dependencies, and whenever such a dependency changes, that first function will rerun. And therefore, in that first function, you can put any side effect code, and that code will then only execute when the dependencies specified by you changed, and not when the component re-renders. So only when your dependencies changed. Now let's have a look at that in action, and for that I prepared a little project which we're also going to have a look at.